looking at Dad's picture. He's been dead for 2 years. Mom, this is all your fault. I don't know how long I can go on like this day after day taking care of you. I had to go out with the guys last night. I'll take you to the doctor, but remember, you fell. If they find out what really happened, I'll go to jail and you'll wind up in a nursing home. You don't want to go there, do you?
What is it like to be aged and abused, wanting help but too afraid to do anything, not knowing what to do, not knowing where to turn? How many older people are abused physically, emotionally, financially, or deprived of basic rights? It is difficult to tell. Many abuse cases go undetected and consequently unreported. There are, however, many reasons why abuse cases go unreported. One of the main reasons is that victims themselves are usually hesitant to report abuse. For example, they may be ashamed to admit that there is family violence. They may be afraid of losing the care they have, or they may be afraid of being put in a nursing home. Another reason abuse cases go unreported is that even you, as professionals, do not want to believe that abuse is occurring, or you're not aware of the extent of elder abuse. There are steps you can take to help the abused elderly. First, you must learn to recognize the signs of abuse and the circumstances surrounding the abuse. Second, you must know the procedures for reporting the abuse. These steps become essential as most professionals working with the elderly are required now by law to report suspected abuse. In many cases, abused elders are incapable of looking after their own welfare. You may be the only source of protection they have.
It was appalling for me to learn from a recent study released by the Select Committee on Aging that about 1.5 million of our elderly fellow Americans are abused, sometimes very severely, and sometimes by members of their own families. This is about 5% of our elderly population.
Those elderly who have severe mental or physical problems are more likely to be victims, and with increased dependency, they are more vulnerable. The abused person is often a woman, over 75, who lives with the abuser. The abuser may be a relative living with the victim who may have ambivalent feelings about being a caregiver. The abuser may have a drug or alcohol problem. The abuser, however, can be anybody, a family member, a caregiver, or even a stranger. There are several beliefs relating to why elderly people may be abused. Mary Joy Quinn, co-author of Elder Abuse and Neglect, explains.
Well, we know that elder abuse and neglect can be intentional or unintentional. With intentional abuse, the person doing the abusing means to inflict the harm. They mean to cause suffering, or they mean to clean out the bank account. Now, they may have various reasons and rationalizations for why they did it, but in reality, they meant to do it. With unintentional abuse, we see something different. We see people who are doing the abusing who may not know that they're being abusive, or may not be capable of understanding or learning that they are being abusive. In these categories, we sometimes have abusers who are perhaps developmentally disabled, or who have a severe substance abuse problem, such as alcoholism or some other kind of drug, or perhaps they have a mental illness which just keeps them from understanding what in fact they are doing. Now, there are several kinds of abuse, and they occur differently in different kinds of situations. Sometimes we see families that are very stressed, and maybe the stress has been going on for years. Perhaps they've always had money problems, or perhaps the elder is just now coming to live with this family, and the caregiver who becomes abusive does so because the relationship has always been bad, or maybe the caregiver feels forced to take care of the older person. At any rate, you have a situation that's much less than ideal.
There are many forms of abuse. The abuse may be physical, including sexual, financial, neglect, abandonment, isolation, abduction, treatment that causes mental suffering, and withholding of goods and services by a care custodian. The current mandatory reporting law in California requires that abuse of elderly and dependent adults be reported by most professionals who work with elderly and dependent adults. The failure to report such abuse can result in a misdemeanor punishable by up to 6 months in jail and/or a fine of up to $1,000. Willful failure to report serious abuse can result in even stronger penalties. Under California's mandatory reporting law, the following types of physical abuse must be reported.
The inflicting of physical injuries, which are criminal violations. These can range from shoving, pushing, hitting, shaking, hair pulling, and burns, to assault with a deadly weapon or force which is likely to produce great bodily injury. Sexual assault and exploitation, which are criminal violations. The unreasonable use of physical or chemical constraint, the use of medication or isolation without authorization, the lack of adequate medical care or over-medication, and the prolonged or continued deprivation of food and water.
Other physical abuse indicators do not signify abuse per se. However, these indicators must be investigated further to see whether abuse may have occurred.
Bruises are very common in physical abuse, and they occur on the arms. They might be bilateral, that is on both sides of the body. They might be unilateral on one side of the body, and they may be at different stages of healing, which would indicate that the bruises happened over a period of time. For instance, early bruising is red purplish, whereas older bruises look more green and they fade to yellow and brown. So if you have an abuser who's telling you that all these bruises that are different colors occurred the day before, then you know that you may have a case of elder abuse and neglect on your hands. I'd like to say something a little bit about cuts and tears on skin as well. Older people frequently have fragile skin. The skin may be dry and it may tear easily, particularly on the forearms. But if you see, again, different stages of healing and lots of them and unlikely explanations for why they occurred, then you do need to think about a diagnosis of elder abuse and neglect. Other signs of physical abuse may be burns, which could come from cigarettes, or it could come from some kind of caustic agent. We also sometimes see signs of someone having been confined, and there could be rope burns, particularly around the waist, or the ankles, or the wrists, or just under the arms. Other signs of confinement in a home might be ropes and chains that are attached to furniture, or doorknobs, or bathroom fixtures. Finally, I want to say a few words about skin ulcerations, which in lay language are often referred to as bed sores. The most common site for a bed sore is the tailbone, and then the next most common site is the hip, over the hip area. You can think of bed sores or skin ulcerations as occurring primarily over bony prominences in our body. Sometimes people rush to judgment when they see a bed sore, and you need to be sure that you're looking at the whole picture, because a combination of things can cause bed sores, not just abuse or neglect.
In addition to suspected physical abuse, which must be reported, California law requires that other types of abuse be reported also. Financial abuse is defined as the illegal or improper use of an elder's funds, property, or assets. Examples include cashing an elderly person's check without authorization, forging an older person's signature, misusing or stealing an older person's money or possessions, coercing or deceiving an older person into signing any document such as a contract or will, and the improper use of conservatorship, guardianship, or power of attorney. As our population ages, we are seeing an increase in the incidence of elder abuse and in the number of suspected abuse cases being reported. According to the National Center on Elder Abuse at the USC Keck School of Medicine, a national elder mistreatment study in 2010 found that about 1 in 10 Americans aged 60 plus have experienced abuse, including emotional, physical, sexual, and financial abuse and potential neglect. The National Center on Elder Abuse also reported that estimates are as high as 5 million persons experience elder abuse each year. The center stated that almost 60% of abuse and neglect cases are perpetrated by a family member, with 2/3 of the abuse by an adult child or spouse. Nationally, the Adult Protective Services continue to see an increase in the number of elders needing help as more suspected elder abuse and neglect cases are reported. It is up to all of us to report suspected abuse and help promote elder justice. There are many reasons why financial abuse may not be reported. Cindy Hendrickson, Deputy District Attorney for Santa Clara County, explains.
The analogy between domestic violence cases and elder fraud cases is very accurate, not only in the fact that both types of cases are underreported, but also the reasons why those cases are underreported are often similar. In a lot of elder fraud cases, as in domestic violence cases, you have victims who know and love the suspects, the perpetrators. A minority of the cases that we prosecute are stranger type cases. The vast majority of the suspects we prosecute are either relatives or trusted friends and caregivers of the victims. Consequently, a lot of our suspects, the victims depend on them to keep them in their home, to take care of them, depend on them for interaction, support, emotional support. And a lot of times they love the suspects. And so even if they're aware of what's happening to them, they're reluctant to blow the whistle on somebody that they love. Also, sometimes the elder fraud victims are, sometimes they're afraid of the suspects, even if there isn't any physical abuse. I think that the statistic that is quoted, that only 1 in 14 elder fraud cases are actually reported, I think that may even be low, that even fewer cases are actually reported.
There are indicators of financial abuse that you should be aware of. However, care must be taken before making accusations.
In a lot of the financial elder fraud cases, there are a lot of facilitators along the way. There are a lot of professionals that are in a position to see that something's going on and to report it. And I've got some cases, let me give you some cases to give you some examples. In one case we had a grandson took out an equity loan on his grandmother's property, $40,000. The grandmother was severely disabled with Alzheimer's at the time this happened, and her condition was readily apparent to anybody that saw her. And so we don't know exactly how the transaction at the bank occurred, but if she was in the bank personnel should have seen her condition and known that she wasn't in a position to make a fully informed decision about whether or not she was going to take money out on her house. The second thing that grandson did was he put her house up for sale, and he actually sold it. And the real estate agent, every time he came to see the lady, was told she was asleep. And so he sold this woman's house without ever having a conversation with her. He should have been suspicious that he never had a conversation with the woman whose house he was selling. If he had had that conversation, or if he had forced that conversation, if he had said, well, I'll come back when she's awake, call me when she's awake, then he would have seen her and he would have known what happened. There's another type of abuse that occurs is people misabuse the power of attorney powers that they have. They will take out loans in the elder's name. They will maybe even obtain the power of attorney when the elder is at a point that they're not mentally competent to give that power. And we prosecuted a case involving a man that got power of attorney over an 83-year-old woman and took some loans out on her rental properties using the power of attorney. And then he in fact forged her name on a resignation. He convinced her to sign a trust that made him the successor trustee. He forged her resignation of trustee and took out 15 more loans as the trustee of her trust, totaling $2.2 million. And then he took those proceeds and he put some in the apartment building, the rental properties account, and some in his own account, and used the money for his own expenses, in addition to paying expenses pertaining to the rental properties. And again, this was a victim who loved the suspect like a son, and at the prelim when she had to come testify. She testified she would have given him anything, but he was still found guilty because she would have given him anything if he asked for it, but he didn't ask, he just took it. Other types of crimes that we see involve caregivers who get access to an elder's credit card, checks. Sometimes an elder will give their caregiver a credit card to go out and buy groceries and things, and then what happens is the caregiver takes that credit card and uses it for their own expenses, and then they come to court when they're charged and say, I had permission to use the credit card. And we have to be very specific. What were you given permission to use it for? And the victim will usually say, if they're competent to testify, it was for groceries or medicine or things like that. So that's an overstepping. The caregiver was given a certain amount of authority to use the credit card, but then they overstepped their authority. In the past, we might have thought that's a civil case because they did have some permission to use the credit card. They didn't steal the credit card. But now we know that that's an embezzlement. When you're given control of somebody else's property and you abuse it, it's not just a civil case, it's a crime.
More resources are being made available at the county and state levels to respond to serious financial abuse situations. In many counties, the Financial Abuse Specialist Team, or FAST team, is a multidisciplinary emergency response team made up of Adult Protective Services, Public Guardian, County Counsel, and the District Attorney. The FAST team investigates suspected financial abuse and determines the need for services as well as the proper course of action. This may include civil litigation or criminal prosecution.
The strength of the team lies in the multidisciplinary aspect of it, that we are attacking these cases on at least 4 different levels. And so we're able to address them comprehensively and quickly, much more so than before the implementation of the FAST team.
In addition to physical and financial abuse, California law requires that these types of abuses be reported also. Neglect, which means the negligent failure of a person having the care and custody of an elder, or the failure of the elder themselves to assist with personal hygiene or to provide for physical health and mental health care needs, safety, and nutrition. Abandonment, which means the desertion of an elder by a caregiver. Abduction, which means taking an elder from this state or keeping them from returning to the state if the elder does not have the capacity to consent. Isolation, which means acts that intentionally prevent an elder from receiving his or her mail, phone calls, or visitors, or false imprisonment. Other treatment with resulting physical harm or pain or mental suffering. Mental suffering means fear, agitation, confusion, severe depression, or other serious emotional distress caused by threats, harassment, or intimidation. Withholding by a care custodian of goods and services, which includes providing for physical and mental health needs, personal hygiene, clothing, shelter, protection from health and safety hazards and malnutrition, and transportation to meet these needs. These types of abuses are often seen in combination with each other. They tend to escalate from emotional and financial abuse to physical abuse. The abuse reporting law applies to both elderly and dependent adults. The law defines an elderly adult as someone age 65 or older, and a dependent adult as someone age 18 to 64 who has physical or mental limitations which restrict his or her ability to carry out normal activities or to protect his or her rights, including those whose abilities have diminished with age. The reporting requirement applies to nearly all professionals who work with elders or dependent adults. Care custodians. These include administrators and employees of facilities providing care to elders or dependents, such as skilled nursing facilities, residential health care facilities, and other public assistance agencies. Health practitioners include physicians, licensed nurses, all health and mental health practitioners, and public health or social service employees who treat elderly or dependent adults. Adult Protective Services staff. This includes all county welfare department staff and law enforcement agencies, police, sheriff, and probation departments. All clergy members. This includes priests, ministers, rabbis, religious practitioners, and similar functionaries, and officers and employees of financial institutions. This includes financial personnel who have direct contact with the elder or dependent adult, or who review or approve the person's financial documents, records, or transactions. The Elder Abuse Reporting Law requires that nearly all professionals who deal with seniors or dependent adults in their normal workday are required to report any abuse. Abuse that you know of or that you reasonably suspect, or if you are told by the victim that he or she was abused.
Mrs. Adams, I'm concerned about the pain that you're having in your left ribs. You may have a fracture there. So I'm going to get a chest x-ray to make sure that the rib is not fractured. In the meantime, I'll have your son come in to stay with you while you're waiting for the additional tests. And I'll be back after everything's completed. Okay. Mr. Adams, I finished examining your mom, and I'm concerned about the seriousness of her injuries, so I'm going to do some additional testing. In the meantime, perhaps you'd like to go in and wait with her while we get the additional tests, and then I'll come back and speak with your mom and then yourself.
Very good.
Okay, see you in a little while.
Thank you, Doctor.
I'm concerned about Mrs. Adams. I suspect that she may have a left rib fracture, so we'll need to get a chest x-ray on her. I'm also concerned about the possibility of some abuse. Her story and her son's story are not really consistent with all the bruises that are present on her examination.
When reporting an abuse case in California, you are required to phone the proper agency immediately and follow up with a written report within 2 working days. These report forms are available at the Adult Protective Services or the Ombudsman Program. If the abuse occurred in a long-term care facility, such as a skilled nursing facility or a residential care home, you must report the abuse to the long-term care ombudsman or the police. For suspected physical abuse in long-term care facilities, the reporting timelines are shorter than for abuse in the community, and reporting may be required to licensing agencies. Please refer to the companion manual, Elder Abuse, Guidelines for Professional Assessment and Reporting, shown on the screen. If the suspected physical abuse results in serious bodily injury, a telephone report and a written report must be made to law enforcement within 2 hours. Also, the written report must be made to the ombudsman and corresponding licensing agency within 2 hours. If the suspected physical abuse does not result in serious bodily injury, a telephone report and a written report must be made to law enforcement within 24 hours. Also, the written report must be made to the ombudsman and corresponding licensing agency within 24 hours. If the suspected physical abuse is allegedly caused by a resident with dementia and there is no serious bodily injury, a report must be made to the local ombudsman or law enforcement agency by telephone immediately and by written report within 24 hours. For all other types of suspected abuse, non-physical, occurring in a long-term care facility, the reporting requirements are the same as suspected abuse in the community. A telephone report shall be made to the local ombudsman or law enforcement agency immediately, and a written report shall be sent to the local ombudsman or law enforcement agency within 2 working days. If the abuse occurred anywhere else, report it to the Adult Protective Services or the police. The important thing to do is to call, and if you have any questions or doubts about a case, call either the Adult Protective Services or the Ombudsman staff for advice, and for emergencies, dial 911. After you make your report, the appropriate agency will follow up on the case. The cases are prioritized according to severity of risk, and the higher risk cases will be investigated first. If you're particularly concerned about a case you've reported, you're encouraged to follow up with the Adult Protective Services or with the Ombudsman. In cases where suspected abuse occurred in a hospital or healthcare facility which receives Medi-Cal payments, the abuse may be investigated and prosecuted by the Attorney General's Bureau of Medi-Cal Fraud and Patient Abuse.
I need to report a possible abuse. No, it was a private home. Potentially the son, but we don't know yet. And who am I talking to?
In the dramatized example, the nurse reported the suspected abuse to the Adult Protective Services. Lorraine, the APS worker assigned to the case, visited Mrs. Adams a few days after the incident. Mrs. Adams seemed very nervous about the visit and did not offer any new information. A few weeks after the first visit, Lorraine returned for a second visit.
Hi, Stephen. Do you remember me? I'm Lorraine Gonzalez. I'm the social worker that visited your mom.
I remember who you are.
May I see your mom?
Is she expecting you?
No, she isn't, but I'd like to see your mom.
Well, yes, I guess so. Yes, if you'll have a seat here, I'll get her.
Thank you.
I was reading in my room, and I heard voices.
Hi, Mrs. Adams. How are you?
I'm fine.
Do you remember me?
Yes, I remember you.
I'm Lorraine Gonzalez. I'm the social worker that visited you when you were in the hospital about 2 weeks ago. How are you doing?
I'm doing okay.
Well, I came to see how you're doing. Stephen, I need to see your mom alone. Would you please excuse us?
Well, I'll just sit over here out of the way.
Well, I need to see your mom alone. I can talk with you afterwards, but right now I need to see her alone.
Well, if you insist, I'll go out to the garage. Okay, Mom?
Okay, Stephen.
Thank you, Stephen. Mrs. Adams, the doctor and I are really concerned about the injuries, your bruises and your broken rib. We're really concerned that that's not consistent with falling down. We're wondering if there's something else that you could tell me so that I could help you. We're concerned that next time maybe the injuries would be even worse.
I'm gonna go out with the guys tonight. I need some money.
Don't leave me alone again tonight. Don't take all my money. Don't take all of it. Stephen, no.
I gotta get out of here.
Why are you doing this to me?
Are you okay?
Mrs. Adams, if you can tell me what happened, I can get some help so that this doesn't happen again. Won't you please let me help you?
It hasn't always been like this. My son has been under a lot of stress, and I have been unable to help him like I used to. And I have to rely on Stephen more and more. He's trying, but he hasn't been able to get a job, you know. So it's hard on him.
Help may be unwanted by the victims, and it may take several contacts before he or she is ready to accept your help. But remember that further abuse can be prevented, and help offered only when you're able to detect the abuse and make a report. In a physical abuse case such as Mrs. Adams, a range of interventions may result. The case may be referred to the district attorney's office to be investigated for possible prosecution. Referrals that may help the family better cope and may help eliminate the abuse may be made to community services such as family counseling, adult health care centers, and respite care. Your timely elder abuse reporting is crucial. Reporting has 4 purposes. First, it is to stop abuse in individual cases and assist with prosecution of the abuser where appropriate. Second, to provide needed services. Third, to compile needed data on the nature and extent of abuse to plan for better services. And fourth, to create an awareness of adult abuse and the need for prevention of such abuse. The law requires that your identity as a reporter be kept confidential and disclosed only to certain law enforcement agencies handling a case or in a court action. Keep in mind that under this law, you are immune from civil or criminal liability unless you act in bad faith or with malicious purpose. However, an investigation, criminal prosecution, or civil court suit against the abuser may result from your report, and you and your records may be subpoenaed to court. For these reasons, you must be sure to document thoroughly and accurately what you have observed and what you have been told. Photographs, charts, and diagrams of injuries are also encouraged. Remember, you are required by law to report known or suspected abuse. If you don't report when you should have, it is a misdemeanor. You are encouraged to read this manual, Guidelines for Professional Assessment and Reporting, prepared by the Elder Abuse Task Force of Santa Clara County. It gives clear step-by-step procedures for each case and offers general direction and approaches for responding to elder abuse cases. Look at these faces, men and women who've contributed to our history, still playing important roles in society. Remember, you may be the only source of protection they have. Hear their silent cry, no one deserves to be abused.